Most of us remember where we were when we heard the news that Nelson Mandela was being released from prison, a hopeful moment that finally our country was on the brink of democracy. And most of us, too, remember where we were on the 10th of April 1993, when the news broke that SACP leader Chris Hani had been assassinated in the driveway of his Boksburg home, a moment of horror and also of fear. Well, 3 decades on, that loss still resonates, and the questions about what he might have gone on to contribute to our country remain. And I'm joined now by struggle veteran and former Cabinet Minister Ronnie Kasrils. Thank you so much for coming in, Ronnie Kasrils. I want to ask you where you were when you heard the news that he'd been killed.
Well, absolutely unforgettable. I was at home in Johannesburg and northern suburbs, quite a modest cottage with my wife of the time, since deceased. And Paulo Jordan phoned me and said, "Have you heard the news?" And there was something in his tone which sent a shiver up my spine. And I said, "No, I'm a news junkie, and I'd normally be into TV and radio." But it was a slow Easter morning, and I can remember him saying, "Chris has been shot." He wasn't aware himself that it was a fatal shot, but he said, "He's been shot." I said, "Where?" He said, "Boksburg at the house." I said, "How is he?" He says, I'll be checking. Jill Marcus is on her way." They were ANC Communications. "And I'll know, and I'll get back to you." I froze, told my wife. We switched on TV and radio. I don't think we were getting anything. And Paulo phones back, and he says, "Gear yourself, Khumalo. Chris has passed." I said, "No, who did it?" He said, "Meet me there. Get to Boksburg." I said, "We're in our car, we're on our way." It was dreadful, absolutely staggering. I felt as though my heart had sunk to my boots.
And obviously a close comrade, but also the broader implications of what this might mean for the fledgling democracy must have been in your mind at that time. What were your feelings about that?
Well, pistol from under my pillow, Russian Makarov, stuck it in my belt, and we got into the car. So everybody was, in the first place, numbed by the fact that this outstanding comrade was dead. Foul murder, implications, and what to do. So for a while, it wasn't so much looking further than the next hour. And, you know, we immediately met with Madiba as the National Executive Committee and so on to work on this. Madiba made his famous broadcast, I think, later that day to calm the nation. I was sent off, as other members of leadership, National Executive, Communist Party. Remember, I was with Chris in the Communist Party as well. I was sent to the border region to speak at a mass meeting there, to calm people down and call for discipline. We realized that this must be part of an attempt to bring about bloodshed on a mass scale. And that was the objective, highly counter-revolutionary. We had to put the word out to our people, be disciplined, be calm. We were very worried about counter-attacks on the white public, which we didn't want, and that what that would lead to. We were also concerned for our own safety, whether this was just a signal for a wider onslaught on Madiba and people and comrades.
Do you believe, I mean, we know that Janusz Wałęsa went to prison. Obviously, he received parole recently. Clive Derby-Lewis was also convicted of being involved in planning the assassination. Do you believe that's where it ended, in just the two of them in this crazy plot to create such destruction? Or do you believe, as the Hani family does, there's more that we haven't heard?
Well, the Communist Party, for example, to answer you in the first place, together with the family, is calling for an inquest and has been doing so for the last 30 years, which is why they opposed the parole, first of all, Derby-Lewis himself. We are well aware that his wife, Gay, was clearly involved. So it went further than the two of them. And I say this about her because there was evidence in relation to lists that were drawn up by a journalist from the then Citizen who had provided her with a list, and there were 20 people on that list. Madiba was number 1, Joe Slovo was number 2, Chris Hani was number 3. So, of course, in terms of going into that background and what was going on in the country, the intention of the dark forces who were dead against any form of change, that clearly was where one suspected there would be that conspiracy. And I would think that it's quite feasible that that's the case, and one is pointing a finger against those forces. I want to say this, that the diversion into, well, was it in the ANC and certain figures there who were wary of the radicalism of Chris Hani, I think that's very mischievous. And particularly at the time, I saw that as a diversion. Now, names of leading ANC people were mentioned as, oh, it must be them because Hani could have been president of the country and not 1 or 2 or 3. I would say to people, just use your brains. The moment Chris Hani in 1991 became the General Secretary of the Communist Party of South Africa meant that he was saying, I'm not interested in becoming president of the ANC or of the country, and it would have been impossible. I had that discussion with Chris at the time because he was in the running. He was immensely popular. And I said, you know, Chris, it clearly means that you're not going to be president of the country, the ANC. And he said, Ronnie, my commitment isn't to that. My commitment is to the Communist Party. Why? Because representing the working class and the poorest of the poor, that's what my mission is. As I well knew, and other comrades, and I was with Chris in relation to that, he wanted to serve the people, he wanted to serve the working class, and for the Communist Party. He would never have become then the leader of the country as president unless there was a communist revolution, which we knew wasn't on the cards. So I'd say that to comrades and people out there, that yes, we need to know, it's very likely that elements who were, to use the term counter-revolutionary, who wanted to stop majority rule, the ANC coming to power, would have been behind the hand of not Wałęsa, he was just a pawn. And he took the action in a spontaneous way. He was simply reconnoitering the area. That is very clear. Derby-Lewis himself could have been utilized, but certainly there was a gun that came from the SADF. And that was the gun that was used. All right, that's a small clue. But I would say the actual circumstance really points in that direction.
Right. And of course, we know after that tragic day on the 10th of April in 1993, Nelson Mandela addressed the nation, but it also was instrumental in the ANC saying the elections have to happen as soon as possible. And that was important.
Precisely. And in fact, de Klerk and the grouping that, yes, they were hoping to actually hold on to power with the ANC, but with the federation factor and group rights, etc. So, of course, that was going on. But they also, Rolf Meyer, Botha, that particular grouping, they wanted that peaceful change, and they felt they would be able to handle the ANC in South Africa that way. So, on the basis of this foul assassination, the two sides at that level, led by de Klerk and Mandela, the view was, come on, let's bury our differences. And de Klerk agreed to a date within a year for that election. So, of course, that precipitated exactly what the assassins and the conspirators didn't want to see.
I think also, and just the fact that Janusz Wallus was identified quickly by Chris Hani's neighbour, who was a white person, perhaps also played a small role in reminding the majority of South Africans that it was time for democracy, that most people wanted that. But I have to move on because we have limited time. And of course, that's what life does. Life moves on for the living, and the living have to make the best of it, even though I imagine this massive whole of what Chris Hani could have contributed must have been quite keenly felt by people such as yourself over the years. And if I think back to some of the missteps, AIDS denialism by Thabo Mbeki, Nkandla, state capture, corruption, even what we're seeing around how Phala Phala is being managed. It's hard, I would imagine, to sort of speculate on how Chris Hani might have managed it. But I suppose it's about reflecting on his legacy. So what are your thoughts in that regard?
I think you're quite right. And we can't be presumptuous, no matter how close we were to him, to say Chris would have done this, that, and the other. But when we look at a human being's legacy, we look at what they stood for, their principles, the courage of the person at a time, not just then, but the dangers of 30 years, armed struggle, his role coming back into the country. This was not just a courageous human being, but a highly principled one who wished to serve the people and the poor, the working class, the unemployed, the women suffering from all sorts of abuse, etc., and patriarchy in relation to the African woman. Chris stood for these things. He stood for the people. And this is what we must understand about legacy, that he was principled. He was against all forms of corruption. He was against the free meal ticket for himself and his family. He stood up for the people and against lies and deceit and those who just care for themselves and will do anything, commit any crime, commit corruption, gangsterism for themselves. And the masses can be damned and laughed at and deceived. Chris would have, I am utterly sure, his life shows it, he would have been the first to damn those people who today and over these years, and especially, you see, the Mbeki and AIDS denialism, you can say, look, what was going on there? But it wasn't Mbeki feeding himself and gaining from it. You look further to Nkandla, to everything that's happened. These people who have let us down, we see the lies and the deceit and the corruption. And that's what's gone against Chris Hani's legacy. But that's the signal for us, everybody today, all people, all races, because he was a great non-racist. He wanted that abolished. But he said the people who could do it was the class force, the social force in the country, the working class organized for a better future, to lead us in that direction. And that's what we must gain from the life of Chris, his principles, his love for the truth and of people.
Best way to honour his legacy is to remember the principles that he was prepared to
Absolutely.
die for, and how we can honour that. And thank you so much. I would imagine it's not an easy day to talk, and yet it is a wonderful tribute that you've paid to him. And thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Of course, that's former SACP Central Committee member and ANC veteran Ronnie Kasrils speaking to us this evening about the legacy of Chris Hani.